It's December 1955 and Ben and Eleanor have gone through it all during this trip. From Atlantic Ocean hurricanes to the suffocating temperature of the Sahara Desert, from war-ravaged Eastern Europe to the roadless landscapes of the Middle East, and through various diseases and infections. They nearly died so many times already. It's actually a miracle they are still alive. But for what? This journey began as a great adventure, filled with hopes and promises. They were sure they would become rich and famous, with the whole world at their feet, and movies made about their lives. But instead, all they have gained so far is extreme poverty, all while sacrificing both their physical health and their mental sanity. And on top of that, they are only halfway done with this trip. This is it. Eleanor has had enough. She is done. It's not the first time she has decided to quit. Her relationship with Ben has always been tumultuous, but this time, she isn't coming back. She is leaving for good, both this trip and this marriage. But Ben couldn't care less. He has no intention of giving up on his dream. To him, it was all a big joke at first. Had he known the consequences, he would have never started his journey. But now, he is too far gone. He is no longer the funny and adventurous man he used to be. At this point, he has turned into a total fanatic. He obsessively takes apart his beat-up Jeep engine and rebuilds it over and over for no reason. He has truly become a madman, and unfortunately, he is about to dive even deeper into insanity. This is the story of Ben Carlin, the first ever and only time in history someone went around the world in an amphibious car. Frederick Benjamin Carlin was born on July 27, 1912 in Northam, Australia, a small farming town about an hour's drive from Perth. His life doesn't start on a happy note as he loses his mother when he is just 4 years old. Perhaps partly because of this, Ben is an absolute brat. His dad tries his best to raise him as a single father, but he struggles to keep up with Ben's unruly attitude. So he decides to send him to a boarding school in Perth when Ben is just 10 years old. And at school, it's not any better. He stands out from his other classmates, but not in a good way. Ben is a troublemaker, and now, instead of his dad, he is driving his teachers crazy. And when Ben doesn't like a school subject, he simply doesn't show up to class. Instead, he prefers to wander around in random places, daydreaming about this big world and its endless possibilities. But despite his erratic behavior, Ben is actually very smart, so he still manages to get into a good university and become a mining engineer. After graduating, he finds a job at a tiny mining outpost in the middle of the Australian desert, some 300 miles east of Perth. And for most of his 20s, all he sees are desolate landscapes, dust and dirt. Having spent all his life in Perth, known as the most isolated major city in the world, Ben grows tired of his situation. Sure, it pays well, but it's depressing. And he has always wanted a more exciting life. So when he turns 27, he decides to leave it all behind to go work in China for a British company. But by now, it's 1939 and World War II is about to begin. So Ben quickly enlists as a field engineer under the command of the British, serving in different places such as India, the Middle East and Italy. If he had already a taste for adventure as a kid, he now truly enjoys his life, to the extent that he really doesn't look forward to going back to the real world. But years pass, and the conflict ended. It is now towards the end of his service in 1946 that he is going to have a crazy idea. It is early in the morning, after a night during which Ben and one of his friends have been going on a bar crawl. Still drunk, they are walking in the US Army Air Force's surplus yard when they come across a weird vehicle. Ben and his friend have never seen anything like it before. It's a car. No, it's a boat. Actually, it's both. In front of them is a 1942 GPW model Ford converted into an amphibious jeep. Ben is instantly mesmerized by the vehicle, and a wild idea pops into his head. Quote, "With a bit of cultivation, you could go around the world in one of these things." Unquote. His friend laughs at the idea, and Ben soon starts laughing as well. This is just a drunk man's joke anyway. Or is it? The more he thinks about it, the more he considers the idea seriously. He wants to do it for real. He longs for adventure more than anything. He doesn't want to settle down just yet. Besides, he believes it will only be a one-year trip, but there is a reason why this vehicle is resting in a yard. It has been engineered to drive on land with the agility of a military jeep, while also having the ability to quickly cross small streams of water. But the truth is that it's terrible at both. Not only it is significantly worse on land than the other vehicles, but he also cannot go faster than a measly 2 miles per hour on water. Its abysmal performance is made even worse considering how much gas it consumes, at 4 mpg. By all accounts, this amphibious vehicle is a total failure. But Ben has made up his mind. So, after getting discharged, he gets on his way to America with the intention of buying one of these things. On his way, he is accompanied by a beautiful 27-year-old brunette named Eleanor, who he had met during the war. Eleanor is originally from Massachusetts, but she had joined the Red Cross for the war. So Eleanor isn't your average girl either, she also seeks adventure. So when Ben shares his idea of traveling the world, she insists of being part of the trip. Although reluctant at first, Ben eventually agrees. And so, on January 3, 1947, they head to an Army surplus auction yard in Maryland, and Ben pays $901, or about $13,000 in today's money, for his very own amphibious Jeep. But it is far from a flashy and new vehicle. Quite the opposite in fact. The one he purchased is dented and rusted, but mostly, it's barely running. Driving it off the lot, it literally takes Ben 2 entire days to drive the 70 miles all the way to the shack he has rented for it in Annapolis. The Jeep is stalling because of clogged fuel lines, the gas tank has fallen out, and the exhaust pipe is coughing toxic smoke. And this is the thing that's supposed to take Ben and Eleanor around the world? By now, most people would have realized how foolish of an idea this entire project was, and would have sold this crap to whoever would be willing to buy it, but not Ben. Instead, he spends an entire year working on it to fix it and to prepare it for the trip. He builds a cabin with a roof, mounts a huge fuel tank, and improves many elements as much as he can. But one thing cannot be changed: the size of the vehicle. Inside, there is a 5 feet by 10 feet space in which Ben and Eleanor will have to coexist. A nightmare for any claustrophobic person. Despite his hard work, the Jeep is still not fully ready, but he is running out of money, so he decides to take it on the water for a test drive anyway. What could go wrong? Well, it turns out everything. He sets his amphibious Jeep in the port of Annapolis with the goal of reaching New York, but the vehicle is terribly slow. It was never built to operate in such deep water. It's only supposed to cross small rivers, which it already struggles with. So, after 3 long days, he has only progressed a ridiculous 50 miles, most of the time maneuvering to avoid rocks. But the worst is yet to come. As he drives once more towards a bunch of rocks, he tries to steer the wheel when he realizes that he is completely paralyzed. Suddenly, he becomes nauseous, and his whole body feels numb. He knows this sensation. He experienced it 10 years ago. This is carbon monoxide poisoning, and it's killing him. Carbon monoxide is a gas with no odor and no color, so he didn't realize there was a leak inside the cabin until experiencing symptoms. As a matter of life or death, he finds the strength to drag himself outside the cabin to lay on the roof. Then it hits. The Jeep has avoided the rocks, but instead it crashes into a metal piling. Ben can't move. If the Jeep sinks, he will drown with it. The minutes pass, and as Ben is slowly regaining his senses, he is able to inspect the damage. He then realizes the hole is just a few inches from a more critical point that would have sent him right to his death. Ben holds his head in his hands, sobbing in between vomiting sessions caused by the carbon monoxide poisoning. If he can't cover a mere 300 miles in the bay, how is he going to do 3,000 miles in the open Atlantic Ocean? Let alone around the world. He hasn't even begun, but he almost died already. You would think that after such an experience, he would finally realize how reckless his idea was and would give up on this project. But you couldn't be more wrong. After such a disaster, what is, for you, the most logical course of action to take, in your opinion? Of course, the right answer is to harass the British consul for payback that he says the Indian army owes him. But in the meantime, to save money, he is forced to live in a shabby hotel in New York City. And, for several months, all he can afford to eat is bread with milk in the morning and a can of spaghetti in the evening. But eventually, his so-called plan actually works, and he receives the equivalent of $26,000 in today's money from the British. I guess you never know what you can get if you just ask for it. In the meantime, Eleanor, who was working in Mexico to save some money for the trip, finally comes back. She joins Ben in New York City, where they decide to get married. Love is such a beautiful thing, isn't it? Well, it appears that they simply got married because they think it will help promote the journey to the public. Just think about the newspaper headline: "Newlyweds on a honeymoon across the Atlantic in a Jeep." That sounds exciting, doesn't it? Indeed, going on an adventure isn't their only motive. In fact, what seems to drive them the most is the prospects of becoming rich and famous. And now, with the extra money, they feel ready. They choose Montreal in Canada as the starting point for what will be their journey around the world. Finally, at the end of the year 1947, it's time to depart. The excitement is palpable as they are driving away from the city, with a crowd of hundreds of people waving at them and wishing them good luck. They drive toward New York City, where they launch their amphibious car in the sea with the intention of reaching the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. How do you think that goes? If truth be told, saying it doesn't go very well would be an understatement. After a mere 40 miles, they realize they cannot steer at all. They are lucky to be saved a few days later, as they were carried away by the current. But by now, you should have grasped the nature of our two novice adventurers. Of course, they try again, and again, and again. On the fourth attempt, their engine dies 300 miles east of New York, and they drift for an entire week and a half before being rescued. This time, they are brought to Halifax, Nova Scotia in Canada. But 4 catastrophic experiences aren't enough to stop them. In fact, they do not even think about giving up. They are so sure they are going to make it. So, for another year, Eleanor is working to make money, while Ben keeps fixing and upgrading the vehicle. He also finds a name for it. That liability of a Jeep's official name becomes half safe. In my opinion, it is probably not even a quarter safe, so I see it as quite an optimistic name. And then, finally, in July of the year 1950, they launch their 5th attempt, departing from Halifax. Their goal is to reach the Azores in no more than 3 weeks. As they are leaving, they feel it. They are confident. This time, it's the right one. Again, they are waving to the crowd of curious people that have come to wish them good luck as they are entering the sea in their unique and weird little vehicle. All the struggles are definitely going to be worth it in the end. They are sure to become rich and famous. They have already had so many articles in various newspapers. But mostly, Hollywood has already contacted them, and they are excited to make a movie about their story. All they have left to do is actually make it across the Atlantic, and all the glory will be theirs to claim. They are now moving forward, albeit at a snail's pace, and the life aboard has nothing of a fun and exciting adventure. Inside the cabin, it's all dark and shadowy to keep the seawater and rain out of half safe. According to Ben, there is no interest in having clear windows because they don't help for navigation anyway. And who cares about looking at an endless ocean? But that's not all. The engine is rattling loudly with a chattering violence that prevents any sleep. Not that they could sleep anyway with the swinging caused by the tiny Jeep bouncing over waves. Add to that the smell of gasoline. But that's not the worst. You may wonder, how do they go to the bathroom? Well, they do it under the passenger seat, participating in creating a stench you may prefer to ignore. But they would probably say that this is also part of the adventure, I guess. Anyway, at least they are actually able to reach the island of Flores in the Azores. But it is at the cost of 32 excruciating days of navigation instead of the 3 weeks they had initially planned for. Nevertheless, it is a huge achievement. Most of the Atlantic Ocean is now behind them. They have already done the unimaginable, pulling off what most people thought was impossible. After a week of rest on the island, they are on their way to the next one, some 160 miles toward the east. Word of mouth spread from Flores to the other islands faster than Half Safe could travel. So, when arriving in Horta, an army of local boats welcomes Ben and Eleanor as if they were some sort of heroes. Half of Horta's population is there to celebrate their arrival. And, for the whole day, the entire island feasts and parties in their honor. Ben and Eleanor are living the dream. But this is just a teaser of what is yet to come once they reach Europe. They are certain of it. Then, for 3 months, they hop from island to island in the Azores and exhibit Half Safe to raise some money for repairs and fuel. During that time, newspapers across the world cover every step of their progress. Despite the early fall starts, it is now all working as they hoped for. They are making it, their dream is happening, and they are exhilarated. Unfortunately, they are about to make a huge mistake. And it all begins when leaving São Miguel of the Açores with the intention of going to Madeira. They underestimate the storm that is brewing. And soon, the rain intensifies, the wind starts blowing, and the current gets stronger while tides are rising. They are not going through a storm, they are stuck in a literal hurricane. Completely overwhelmed, the motor sputters and then stops completely. There is nothing they can do. It goes from bad to worse, with giant 50-foot waves now crashing against a small floating jeep, threatening to capsize the whole thing every minute. For hours and then for days, Ben and Elinor are prisoners of Half-Safe at the mercy of the ocean, drifting aimlessly. The water has infiltrated everywhere, and inside the cabin there isn't a single thing that is still dry, all the way to the pillows and blankets. Ben and Elinor are soaked and shivering, nauseous and exhausted, and without radio transmission, the end is near. But after 2 never-ending weeks of torture in near complete darkness, the ocean is getting calmer, and suddenly they can hear a familiar sound. The engine has restarted. They open the cabin to observe a peaceful ocean reflecting the sun under a blue sky. Then they get a signal on the radio. They have long been considered dead, but they are somehow still alive, and incredibly, Half-Safe is still in condition to continue the journey. After another ship has brought them additional fuel, they are eventually able to join Madeira. From there, after a few more months of repair, they are back on the ocean. This time, being luckier with the weather, they are able to land on the Western Sahara without too much difficulty. 7 months after leaving Canada, Half-Safe has finally crossed the Atlantic. Landing near Cap Jubail in Morocco, they are elated. They have done it. They have achieved the impossible. After 3 years of hell, they have conquered the Atlantic. They can't wait for the opportunities that await them in Europe. But first, they have to cross the desert to join Casablanca. And they lost their only spare tire somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So they have to be extremely careful to avoid blowing a tire, or the journey would end right there. Most of you probably think of the Sahara Desert as a panorama of dunes with fine sand, but the truth is that most of it looks a lot more like that, a dry landscape covered with pointy rocks. So to be cautious, Ben and Elinor drive no faster than 2 miles per hour. It is a game of patience, as they resist the urge of going faster to get away from the intense heat, but the hellish drive is worth it. Because when they finally arrive in Casablanca, once again they are treated like heroes. Ticket sales for the exhibition of Half-Safe are selling like hotcakes. Local media pays them generously to interview them. They receive enormous attention from all sides. More confident than ever, they then cross the Strait of Gibraltar. Not without difficulty, but it doesn't matter. They are now in Europe. Driving through Portugal, Spain and France feels like a breeze. It's a well-deserved vacation. With the money earned in Casablanca, they splurge and take advantage of the situation to go sightseeing. Although Paris ends up being unprofitable because they are still recovering from the war, the English show a lot of interest in their story. Leaving Half-Safe behind in Paris, they fly to London to meet with editors at the Clarion newspaper. An agreement is reached for a hefty sum of money in exchange for a month-long promotional tour in the UK. They celebrate their success back in Paris, enjoying luxurious hotels and exquisite food, and for 2 months, Ben and Elinor are on cloud 9, absolutely ecstatic. The life they have longed for is becoming a reality. This is everything they have dreamed of since they started their journey. With all the support they are receiving, the rest of the trip will be a piece of cake. But what they didn't know at the time was that this exact moment would mark the high point of their journey. And unfortunately for them, from now on, things would only go downhill. And it started crumbling down when the Clarion newspapers decided to cancel their contract at the last minute with no justification. Now, their vacation seems like a huge waste of time and money. And now, they have to quickly find a new sponsor. So, to attract more attention, they decide to cross the English Channel with Half-Safe. And it works! Once they land in England, a huge crowd is cheering for them. And everywhere they go, they are surrounded by a herd of people. But the attention around Ben and Elinor Enormous at first, dies as quickly as it started. Their journey across the Atlantic proves to be nothing more than a short-lived curiosity to the few people who actually paid to see the jeep and meet the crazy couple. In reality, their adventure doesn't inspire anyone. People are just confused about why they are doing such an expedition. What is even the point? On top of that, many people simply don't believe their story and treat them like they are charlatans. The situation is terrible. They are totally out of money again. Half-Safe is in pieces, rusted by salt water, and Ben and Elinor cannot stand each other anymore. Ben, now 39 years old, is forced to accept the obvious. The impossible journey is over. You may wonder why he would give up now, after all the energy he has put in this project so far. He has faced much more difficult challenges, and this is not the first time he's broke. What happened to his reckless ambition and his foolish tenacity? The truth is that Ben has finally reached his breaking point. Quote, I had lived from suitcase or kit bag for 13 years. The travel urge was long satisfied. If beforehand I had been persuaded that the trip would take longer than a year, I would have dropped it. Now, 5 years later, I had barely started. Unquote. So, Ben and Elinor separate. She takes a secretarial job in London, and Ben moves to Birmingham, where he finds a job as a garage mechanic. For 2 years after that, he tries to sell Half-Safe as it is gathering dust in a corner of the workshop. But he can't actually find the resolve to let it go. Inside of him, the fire that inspired the whole adventure isn't completely out yet. So one day, and for no apparent reason, he begins working on the Jeep. After that, every day, in his spare time, he fixes it. He adds a larger gas tank, rebuilds the engine, fixing and modifying one element after another. He has so many reasons to stop. Debt, exhaustion, near certainty Half-Safe cannot make it all the way, but he has one single reason to keep going. Quote, such an opportunity could never occur, and I'd kick holes in my coffin if I passed it up. Unquote. Basically, for him, it is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and he cannot pass on it. So, 4 years later, on April 20, 1955, Ben and Elinor reunite to climb into Half-Safe once again. They are back together, back in this ridiculous journey with the determination to finish it. They leave England and cross the English Channel, traveling through France, Switzerland and Italy. Yet, the magic of the early days is long gone. On the way, Ben and Elinor are fighting the entire time. The public attention isn't coming back either. Now, the few media interviewing them are just here to ask them to prove they actually crossed the Atlantic. No one believes them, but Ben doesn't care anymore. This journey is no longer about just becoming rich and famous. It has become his purpose. He has to do it. Elinor soon starts to regret having come back to this ridiculous adventure. And she is about to regret it even more. Because when they arrive in Turkey, the month of May is already ending. Which means they are going to cross the deserts of the Middle East right into summer. Have you ever been in a sauna? When the temperature is so hot that the air burns your nose as you are trying to breathe in. Now, imagine being trapped in the endless desert of Syria, Iraq, and Iran, driving at a walking speed inside a vehicle that gets so hot, the plastic inside is literally melting, and that every day for over 3 entire months. Somehow, in these gruesome conditions, they are able to make it all the way to Kolkata in India by the end of the summer, albeit at a dire cost. Elinor has lost 30 pounds, her hair is falling out, and her skin is so dry that she looks unrecognizable. As if this isn't enough, India doesn't spare them either. Both of them end up bedridden for weeks. Elinor because of non-stop stomach infections, and Ben because of dengue fever contracted through mosquitoes. Once they are finally back on their feet, they again find themselves without $1 in their pocket. But Ben has a plan. He has written the story of their journey across the Atlantic. He has decided that if no one was interested in making a movie or writing articles about their journey, he would write the book himself. But Ben has no respect for journalists and all the people in the real world who always seem to look down on him. Those jerks always treat him like a charlatan. So for once, he decides to behave like one. He sends his story to 2 different publishers in the US, hoping to be paid twice for the same job. What he doesn't anticipate is that they would quickly find out and he wouldn't receive a penny. Ben is fuming. He is furious, but he has a backup plan. This time, he sends his story to a single British publisher. Luckily, the book is going to be published. And on top of that, the publisher offers and finances a promotional book tour in Ben's homeland of Australia. This is almost unhoped for. Here is a golden opportunity to not only make it back financially, but also to spread the word about his adventure and reach more people than ever. Ben can already imagine his book turning into a bestseller. Except, this chance is about to disintegrate and crush every last hope of ever getting the attention he and Eleanor desperately seek. They are flown to Australia and Half-Safe is shipped there. But when they arrive, the book they are supposed to promote hasn't arrived in the vast majority of the bookshops in Australia. To top it all off, the book reviews are terrible. The truth is that Ben isn't much of a writer, far less a storyteller. His book is full of overcomplicated jargon. You would get lost in between tedious technical details and awkward jokes. It has nothing of a great adventure tale. And most people aren't exactly fans of such boring books. Stories, whether real or fictional, are supposed to be entertaining and engaging. But even when this is the case, many people still get bored while reading. Traditional audiobooks are not exactly the most immersive option either, and movies often differ significantly from the original book. But nowadays, we have an alternative, thanks to Graphic Audio, an award-winning audiobook company that offers you a truly entertaining experience. It's not just audiobooks, it's an experience filled with relevant cinematic music, immersive sound effects, and voice actors that truly bring the book to life, all without altering the author's vision. They have over 1,700 titles spanning many genres such as adventure, horror, mystery, romance, and many more you can choose from. So click on the link in the description and get your first graphic audiobook today. You can purchase any title on their website and enjoy it for life with their mobile app, or directly download any title into your computer or smartphone. Again, click on the link in the description to experience your first graphic audiobook today. Back in Australia, this is not how Ben imagined his return into his home country. When he learns most booksellers haven't received his book yet, he completely and utterly loses it. This book is his last hope and it's going up in smoke. In his head, it's all because of the incompetence of his publisher. So he begins charging exorbitant prices for viewings of the Jeep and refuses to cooperate with booksellers. But all that leads to is further sabotaging his own book, throwing away any slight chance of his book actually selling. Ben falls into a deep and desperate state of psychosis. He cannot stand anyone, and he is filled with hatred against the entire world. This is the last straw for Eleanor. She has endured Ben's insufferable personality far too long already, and now it's becoming even worse. There is no way she's going to stay with such a disturbed man. Besides, she is terrified by the idea of pursuing the trip after almost losing her life on the way to India. At this point, she has no reason to keep going anymore. So she leaves, and this time, whatever Ben says, she is not coming back. Thus, when Ben flies back to Australia, Eleanor isn't by his side. In fact, they will never see each other again. Back in Kolkata, Ben is all alone when he launches Half-Safe in the river that crosses the city. He navigates downstream to reach the sea. And, for many days, with practically no sleep, he travels in the open sea all the way to Myanmar's biggest city, Rangoon. Ben has always been quite reckless, you may say crazy, or even nuts. But up to now, believe it or not, his trips were still relatively well planned. However, whatever little judgment he had is now totally gone. As he is checking his compass, it starts changing shape and melting before his eyes to reveal a dragon-slaying Roman warrior. You have probably understood. Indeed, Ben is suffering from serious hallucinations, caused by the drugs he is taking to keep going with no sleep. Eleanor was his safeguard, but now she is gone, and without her by his side, his behavior isn't just erratic, it is straight up suicidal. Still, he manages to join Rangoon, alive. As soon as he arrives, he starts preparing for the next step of his expedition. There is a military road he needs to go through to reach Thailand, but officials tell him the 40-mile stretch has been destroyed, and now it's blocked by boulders. Even the army's jeep don't pass there anymore. But Ben is numb to these warnings, he simply doesn't care. He is on a mission. The alternative route would lead to a detour of hundreds of miles and he cannot afford it. So he takes a look at the map one more time and simply draws a straight line between Rangoon and the Thailand border. However, he may have regained a bit of common sense because he decides to look for a partner that would accompany him for the trip. Barry, a fellow Australian, comes forward and both men are on their way through the forbidden route. The temperature inside the cabin is easily over 145 degrees. But unlike the desert, which was akin to a sauna, here the humidity makes the environment more similar to a hammam. With the jungle on both sides and a path covered in rocks and boulders, it takes over 10 strenuous hours in these conditions to drive the 40 miles that separate them from Thailand. Fortunately, past this challenging road, it is a relatively comfortable stroll through Thailand, Vietnam, China, and finally Hong Kong. From there, they are lucky enough to reach Japan without too much trouble. Let's just say it goes as well as it could given the quality of the life inside Half Safe. It's still pretty miserable, especially with Ben's psychosis not showing any sign of improvement. It is so miserable in fact that as soon as they set foot on the southern shore of Japan, Barry abandons Ben to himself. Ben is all alone again, and he is about to face his last but most dangerous obstacle of them all, the largest ocean in the world, the Pacific. But first, and as usual, he needs money. So he gets in touch with some of the journalists that have enthusiastically covered the early parts of the trip. But the man they meet in Japan is drastically different from the man they have known. Ben used to be an intrepid but joyful adventurer. But now, he isn't even a shadow of his former self. He has truly become a broken man and a drunk. He has become too eccentric, too unstable, and too dangerously obsessed for any story to be published. And with Elinor gone, the slight interest left in the project has vanished. The innocence and the appeal she brought is no more. Besides, the journey has taken too long and the public has lost interest a long time ago already. Ben, forced to seek money elsewhere, eventually manages to convince an oil company to pay for the fuel for the Pacific crossing in exchange for an 18-day promotional tour of Japan. In the meantime, he also finds a new companion, by the person of Boye, an American magazine editor. And if you think this will help Ben get it together, you are sorely mistaken. Boye would later describe this promotional tour in a way that paints a disturbing image of Ben, who would allegedly constantly complain about having to follow orders from the oil company. He apparently hated feeling like he owed anything to his sponsor. So he would go on a rampage every night, visiting one bar after another, drinking until he couldn't. He would pick up a different girl every night and bring them back to the hotel in the same room he was sharing with Boye. And as you can imagine, he didn't bring girls back to play a game of Scrabble. Of course, this had Boye rethink twice about the man supposed to bring him across the Pacific. But eventually, the promotional tour ends, and on June 12, 1957, they launch Half Safe in the ocean, heading northeast with the intention of joining Alaska, on the other side of the Pacific. It only takes 5 days for problems to start. The Jeep fuel supply is stored in large steel tanks towed behind Half Safe by ropes. Except the ropes got tangled, pulling the fuel tanks and the Jeep together. And, with the waves, they start crashing against each other. If the repeated collision bridge the hull, Ben and Boye will end up at the bottom of the ocean, along with the Amphibious car. But it is not so simple. In this part of the North Pacific, the water is extremely cold all year round, hovering near 30 degrees, essentially at freezing temperature. However, it's not like Ben has any choice, so he jumps off with no hesitation. Diving under the Jeep, he somehow manages to untie the ropes. When he comes back on board, he is covered with bleeding cuts and bruises. But 10 days later, it gets even worse. Whereas the trip is going as well as it can go, the engine suddenly comes to a stop. Upon getting out of the cabin to observe what happened, Ben finds a Japanese fishing boat net knotted around Half Safe propeller. Once again, he is forced to jump off in the freezing water, this time armed with a knife. Underwater, he begins slashing at the net like a wild beast. But soon, his extremities become so numb that he has to get out. He swims towards the Japanese boat 100 yards from there, climbs aboard and collapses on the deck, paralyzed by the cold. Japanese fishermen attempt to quickly warm him up with a fur coat and move him near the flames of their galley stove. When Ben recovers his senses, he realizes Half Safe is still tangled with the net. So he looks at the fisherman, drinks an entire bottle of sake in one go, and goes back at it, finally cutting the propeller loose. When Ben ultimately manages to get back aboard the Jeep, he is shaking like a jackhammer. Then, he relieves himself in a can and passes out. Hours later, he wakes up in a rage, screaming and kicking Boye for urinating in the can. To you, this may sound like a funny anecdote, but this isn't an isolated incident. Ben has completely lost touch with the real world. He is imagining arguments that never happened, yelling at Boye to follow orders, and then yelling at him again because he did. And for 3 long months, Boye has to risk his life while undergoing Ben's tantrums and psychosis. All in the challenging conditions of navigation that we know. So, when they finally land in Anchorage, Alaska, Boye is quick to run away and return to his home. Ben is finally standing on the very last continent of this journey. Seated on the driver's seat of Half Safe, he closes his eyes and lets out a sigh. He expected exhilaration, pure joy and satisfaction. Instead, he is more lonely and depressed than ever. Quote, "With no more oceans to cross, my life was ended," unquote. Half Safe has become a refuge from relationships, responsibilities, jobs, basically everything related to real life. And now, it is on the verge of disappearing. For years, he worried he would never complete his Odyssey. But now, he is worried he will. Indeed, the drive he has left to reach Montreal and complete this adventure is nothing more than a road trip. So, for 8 months, he takes his time traveling the US. He goes to Hollywood, trying to convince someone to make a movie out of his story. When this doesn't work, he drives all the way to Ford headquarters in Detroit. But all Ford wants is to forget about this failure of a vehicle. After that, he keeps driving aimlessly, but eventually, he must resign himself. The journey is over. So, on May 13, 1958, he returns to Montreal where it all started. It has been over a decade of dedicating his entire life to this insane adventure. He is now 45 years old. His hair has turned grey and he has gained a lot of weight. During this journey, he has worked on his Jeep countless hours to prepare it, to improve it, to repair it again and again. He has been married and divorced. He has faced death more times than he could count. He has lived in abject poverty and eventually fell into a form of insanity. But somehow, he made it back, alive. When he finally arrives in Montreal, there is no crowd, no friends, no family. No one is here to welcome Ben from the crazy adventure he is coming back from. He turns off the engine in a random street and jumps out of the Jeep. Totally alone, he looks around him and starts walking with nowhere to go. After this, not much is known about Ben. It's like he simply vanished. Well, it's not entirely true. We still know that a few years later, he remarried in the US, though it was short-lived. His new wife left him and disappeared when she was pregnant with their daughter. Ben never really met his only child, although he tried for years to send her letters. Having no real reason to remain in the US anymore, he decided to head back to his hometown in the area of Perth, Australia. There, he spent the rest of his life. When his daughter finally reached out to him, Ben had just passed away, following a series of strokes. Probably in part due to his many excesses, he died relatively young at just 68 years old in 1981. Eleanor, for her part, ironically married an airline pilot whom she and Ben had met during their trip in Madeira. She passed away many years later in 1996 at 78 years old. Finally, the vehicle that had traveled around the world, Half Safe, had been in an old barn somewhere in the US for many decades. But eventually, it was found and bought by Ben's old school in Perth, where it remains on display to this day. In the end, Ben and Eleanor never really become famous, and much less rich. But was this really what Ben was truly after? Behind his chaotic behavior, we can find a few clues about his ultimate goal. He wanted to matter the way great explorers mattered. He wanted to make his mark on history. He wanted to be remembered for what he accomplished. That's why he took so many pictures of his journey. That's why he noted everything with such detail, and that's why he was so upset no one cared. Like tossing a bottle in the sea, he hoped this story could reach someone who cared someday. And although no one cared during his lifetime, and no one even believed him, now we remember him for being the one and only person to ever circumnavigate the world in an amphibious vehicle. But will someone ever repeat this feat? At the time, there were many legal uncertainties, but in today's world, there are many more regulations and laws in place, and it is almost impossible to drive through the Middle East as he did because of the endless conflicts in those regions. So it's very likely that Ben's achievement will never be done again. I am not sure how he felt at the end of his life, but what I know is that Ben's story is proof that you need to live for yourself. That with the power of persistence, despite what everyone tells you, you can overcome anything and achieve greatness. But it shouldn't be something to impress others, but rather something you will truly be proud of. After all, whether or not someone will ever find your story and be inspired by it isn't something you can control. However, at the end of your journey, will you be satisfied?